Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Morning, Matthew.
Morning.
How you going?
Yeah, good. We're sitting here with multiple things.
Yeah, there's hardly room on the desk. There's Bibles and computers.
I've got my phone with list of notes and my iPad with the text open and all sorts of notes through that. Man, we've got some. There's plenty of detail here today, Stu, to get through, but there's some great stuff.
It sure is.
What are we looking at?
Well, welcome, listeners. Great to have you with us for Thrive Deeper. And we are picking up and continuing our journey through the book of Ezekiel. And Matt, we're moving into now the future hope. We've been through the defeat of the tribes of Israel, really, and the southern kingdom in exile. This vision is coming to Ezekiel in exile, but now we're looking forward to a future hope as we pick up from Ezekiel chapter 40, and we're going to try and work our way to the end of the book. Now, interesting, as I've done a bit of research on this particular passage, it seems that quite a number of biblical scholars would acknowledge that this vision of this new temple is pretty difficult to interpret. And some have even described it as being the most difficult to interpret in the Old Testament. So, it's going to be interesting to talk through this and see what it is that God is trying to say to us, but also to Ezekiel in that time, in that moment, to those people.
It's difficult, but it's really fascinating the way that this is all set out, and this vision that he has of not only the temple but the land, it's this amazing theological vision, like three-dimensional theology, and so much of the details. Because we got to remember that this is a vision. It's not like when Moses went up to the mountain and received the instructions for the tabernacle. It's different to that in nature. We've seen Ezekiel having visions before. We're going to, when we turn over to the book of Daniel in the next episode, we're going to see visions that Daniel has of composite creatures coming out of the sea, and all of these visions, they're presenting truths in a very colourful way that people at that time could connect with. And we've got to be remember that the people are connecting with this with a level of immediacy that we don't necessarily connect with. And certainly Ezekiel, because remember, Ezekiel is a priest and he's very familiar with the temple. At this stage,
and the temple practices and everything that went around that. Because we look back knowing what we know about Jesus, but of course they didn't know that at this point in time.
Yeah, and they still, remember, even though we're 25 years into the exile, we're still in memory of the temple, and the people would have carried that memory of the temple. And so this vision of the land and the temple, it really does speak to a people that are immersed in that kind of symbolism and that world. And so it's both the similarities and the differences that are going to speak to this, because there are some things that were very familiar to them that are now going to change, and that's going to speak volumes. So, but big picture, Stu, the importance of this vision at the end of the book is, we've had this, these chapters 37, the Valley of the Dry Bones.
Yes.
We're now moving from a valley to a mountain. We've had the dry bones, and then we've had the great victory. Mm-hmm. And look, even in ancient Near Eastern literature that talks about these big religious themes, there is this pattern of the God overcoming his enemies and then establishing his temple. That's now whether this is he's using that same literary pattern. I mean, that may be the case.
Right.
This is referring though to something that, a sequence that we see in a number of different ways in prophetic literature about the future. There's judgment, and then there's the establishment of a new kingdom, new creation, really. Yeah. And so this is associated with that idea. The Gog and the Battle of Gog and Magog. We've been pushed to look really even to our future there. And there's every reason to think that what we're reading here is looking beyond that even. Okay, so now there's a question around to what degree of literalness is that a word?
Literality.
do you ascribe to this? I think, again, this is where we need to remember it's a vision, and there's so much theology here involved in the various elements of this. It's not that this could not be done, but it's such that, there's enough theology here to think that, look, this could be a really graphic way of presenting the future reality to a people steeped in this sort of imagery and this symbolism.
Yeah.
It's actually a very appropriate way to present a future reality that transcends anything to do with temples and specific land divisions. For example, in the land divisions, you've got all the 12 tribes. I don't know if you noticed this,
yes.
but you get all of the 12 tribes, the traditional 12 tribes, which by this stage have completely disappeared into the nations. And so really, in order to recover those 12 tribes, you're really talking about the ingathering of the nations.
Yes.
But there's still, in the way that these divisions work out, it's still speaking theologically to that. Now, there are some that say, no, this is something that's going to be fulfilled in a very literary sense in either, maybe in the millennium, for example, if for those who hold to a literal 1,000 years following the return of Christ. Because remember, a lot of scholars see this period as the Revelation 20 millennium. Others see the return of Christ and then a literal millennium after that. The scene is pretty split between those sort of options. So there's room perhaps, for a literal fulfillment. But, again, even if you do hold to a literal fulfillment of this temple, you're still looking at something that is meant to convey something beyond itself.
Yes. Yeah.
So even, so the first temple, there was a literal temple, obviously.
Yeah.
You can, today you can visit the sort of remains of the temple platform, but that literal temple still pointed to something beyond itself. It was three-dimensional theology, and it was meant to convey something beyond just itself. So
now saying that it's a vision, important to remember this isn't just a dream of Ezekiel's or Ezekiel's way of trying to figure out how do I cast hope to these people. This is a vision that Ezekiel got from the Lord, like all the other visions that he has got, and those visions did come to pass. So we're not, that doesn't to say this is literal, but it's not, I wouldn't want listeners to think that's just Ezekiel trying to figure out a way to create some hope here. This is God taking Ezekiel and giving him this vision.
Remember, one of those visions is the vision of the valley of the dry bones.
Correct.
And the dry bones having flesh and yes, that is, he's talking there about reviving a dead people of God.
Yes.
That is, and we would say that began to be fulfilled on the day of Pentecost.
Yes.
Because the day of Pentecost with the blowing wind and everything really evokes that imagery. And I think it wants, Luke wants us to see that is the fulfillment of Ezekiel chapter 37. So there is a theological fulfillment. There's also potentially a literal fulfillment in the resurrection, but the point of these visions really is conveying something theological in a this
totally.
picturesque
and I
form.
think it would be correct to say that certainly this vision in a literal sense has not been fulfilled as yet. There's not been a temple built like this. Even when they did return, the temple was not built like this. So if we are thinking, if listeners are thinking this potentially could be a literal temple, then clearly it hasn't happened yet. So it's definitely future. Either way, we look at this, it's a future vision.
Yeah, that's right. So the vision is, just to summarize, in case listeners, if you haven't read this and you're not familiar with these chapters. So from chapter 40 through to 48, we have this vision where Ezekiel is taken, and he's taken to the land, and he sees this new temple. And it's a temple that in many ways is like Solomon's temple, but it has some very key differences. And it's a temple that is also within a land that has land divisions that in some ways mirror the actual temple itself. So there's, in the same way as within the temple, you have, a holy of holies, and then a holy place, and then you have a sacred precinct, and then outer courts, and you have these gradations of holiness, separateness, so to speak.
Yeah.
you also have in the divisions of the land, you have this sacred strip. So if you think of the land of Israel as the strip from, present day Lebanon down to, the Gulf of Aqaba, it's different. People might find this difficult to picture, but it's basically that strip of land at the far eastern edge of the Mediterranean, right? And basically, what you can picture is with the division of the land is these strips of land that go down like stripes, horizontal stripes, and so it's much more what's the word, like symmetrical, or because he basically places in the middle a sacred strip.
Yes. And
then moving out from that sacred strip are all the tribes. There's the priests and the Levites, have there, and then you've got Benjamin and Judah on either side. And then you move out, and even the organization of which tribes is even significant. There's
Joseph gets two stripes, I think, isn't it? No, two.
Actually, Joseph, yes, that's right. Yeah. So you get this, even in, which tribes are chosen. We won't get too much into those details. Yeah. So you get this mirroring of these degrees of, sort of holiness in that sort of sense. Now, the importance of this, Stu, is that in all of this, so first of all, there's in the context of salvation history, in the context of the book. Okay, so in the context of salvation history, what this looks like is it the same sort of language of separation and ordering as you have in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, God separated this from that, separated this from that.
Right, yeah.
The language of separating is repeated there because it's associated with holiness. You separate this from this, and distinction is very important. And so you get this same language of ordering here in the temple. So this is where this is the language of a kind of new creation, and that's in the big salvation history, which is what perhaps lends support to this being a sort of a theological depiction of a new creation. Mm-hmm. Now, what also lends strength to that interpretation is the fact that clearly Revelation chapter 21 and 22, but particularly chapter 22, draws very explicitly, actually, on Ezekiel's temple. Mm. But there too, in the same way as Ezekiel's temple makes some changes to Solomon's temple in order to say something, so in the vision given to John in the book of Revelation, there are changes there also that reflect. So, for example, you get the holy city, the New Jerusalem. This vision of the New Jerusalem, as I said, clearly draws from Ezekiel's temple, but you don't get the actual holy of the temple buildings in there.
No,
it says in Revelation 22, there was no temple in the midst, and the idea is that the whole thing is really the temple, in a sense, and the river, and you get the river of life and so forth. And so this move from from the tabernacle, Solomon's temple, then to Ezekiel's temple, then to John's holy city in Revelation, you get this kind of sequence that in itself, that development has enormous theological significance, the way that the one moves to the other, because it's an unfolding vision based on how much has already been revealed.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so I think that's where I think we need to focus on the theology being conveyed by these things. Whether or not there is going to be a literal fulfillment of this is less important.
It's interesting though, because it is so specific, isn't it? It's like begs the question, why be so specific? And it all works. I've seen 3D depictions of what this temple would look like, and why so much specificity around dimensions and where things are placed and how many windows and how many pillars, and that there's palm trees and that there's cherubim and all the
specificity.
Why, if that's perhaps we're saying not important, are we not saying that it's not important?
Yeah, well, remember, he's painting a picture with words here for people to imagine this. Now, when you know a building really well, and you've got it in your head, particularly for he's giving a tour, and you're recognizing differences as you're going through. Oh, hang on, it's like, described in a vision your house, and then we go here. Oh, hang on, what?
No, that's not where that is.
Yeah, that's not where that is, and
that's bigger than that, or smaller than that. Or,
yeah,
right. Okay.
So it's and so you're right. I mean, we can create now, and there are some great pictures of Ezekiel's temple. You can just Google it. A model reconstruction of Ezekiel's temple. Now that is the point. The point is that there's enough detail here that we can actually create models of this,
right?
And we can see it what it looks like. And the importance of that is that in the same with the first temple, that what it looks like is actually important because it conveys three-dimensional theology. Now, as I said, there are some who do see that the possible literal fulfillment, and that may be the case. But as I said, even if there is, that's still pointing beyond itself.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's still something that has symbolic significance, right? So either way, we need to focus on the symbolic significance.
Yes.
That was even the case with the first temple that was certainly real.
Yeah.
It begged us to look at its theological significance.
And the tabernacle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we've moved here. The big problem, of course, in the early chapters of Ezekiel, of course, is the departure of the glory of the Lord from the temple. So, and the big question for the Jewish people at this time was the rebuilding of the temple. That was for them in a world of temples. That was what the answer, God returning to us, or us returning to God. It definitely revolved around the question of the temple. So the good news for Ezekiel will have to look like something like that. You know what I mean? Yep. It's when is the glory of God going to return back to us? And in a sense, God is painting a picture of his return of his glory to his people in a way that they can understand and picture and visualize. Yep. Now, I mean, one of the problems, of course, when they did actually return, it didn't really look like Ezekiel's temple.
No,
I mean, it didn't even really look like Solomon's temple. And so there has always been this, and there's a long tradition of rabbinic interpretation of these chapters and what this could refer to. And there's so much discussion around these chapters. You're not wrong when you say that, there are lots of people who have been scratching their heads over how to interpret this. So that's kind of the big picture. We're talking about the return of God's glory. It's answering that question. There's the elements of the new creation there. It's using these symbols drawn from the temple, and it's describing theologically really the elements of a new creation. There's the connection with Revelation 21 and 22. And in a way, for John, he's reinterpreting this through the lens of fulfillment in Christ. That's why in John's holy precinct, in his holy city, there's there's no temple as such, no altar, because that's been fulfilled. So you get this sort of unfolding thing. Yeah.
A great way to lead into this to chapter 40, which you've just done, is just the very last part of chapter 39, where God's now starting to talk about displaying his glory among the nations. That's kind of the lead into
he says in fact the very last verse of chapter 39 is, I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the people of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. And of course then you've got this grand vision. Right, now let me show you this grand vision. And a key part of this is in chapter 43, as we'll see, is the return of the glory of the Lord. Now, just moving through some of the details of this now, Stu. First of all, it's interesting. It's in the 25th year of the exile. That's significant. And again, numbers are significant because, of course, the imagery of the year of Jubilee comes to mind. And this is the halfway point to the year of Jubilee. So it's a point that I guess points to a Jubilee. I mean, they're not literally halfway there, but the 25-year point, in a Jewish mindset, 25 years marks, 25 years to a Jubilee. So it is pointing beyond to their liberation, basically. It's a way of doing that. So, and
it kind of alludes here a little bit to how long Ezekiel had been in exile prior to the fall of Jerusalem as well, because it kind of says 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem, after the city. So that gives us a bit of an insight into how long Ezekiel was already in exile for.
It's interesting. The vision takes him to a very high mountain. I don't know if you notice this, but he doesn't identify that with Jerusalem or Zion. And you sort of, there could be some reason to do that. But the interesting thing is when you go to the divisions of the land, as one of the most prominent commentators on these chapters pointed out, that when you work with the divisions, the sacred precinct, the strip in the center, actually kind of moves north. Now some reconstructions of this still have Jerusalem as the mountain.
Okay.
And this is the Ian Dargoid, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but wrote the New International Commentary in the Old Testament, as well as the NIV application commentary. And yeah, he points out that the sacred strip actually moves a bit north, and it seems like that where he sees the temple precinct is actually more aligned with Shiloh than Jerusalem.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there could be, possibly given that there was a sense in which, Mount Zion had been desecrated, that perhaps there was some sense of moving beyond that. Now, I mean, it's just interesting that he doesn't necessarily mention what the mountain is. However, I mean, look, that's a suggestion. As I said, there are reconstructions of this that do still have Jerusalem as the, Mount Zion as the mountain of Jerusalem as this, and again, very high mountain. It's just that he's not, he just doesn't mention, which is interesting for the absence of a mention of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah says, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the chief among the mountains. It will be raised high above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that they will walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So there's still an association with Zion and Jerusalem, but is this a new Jerusalem here? Is this
and then Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, they won't worship me on this mountain or that mountain.
Yeah, that's right. So it's, and again, remember, this is a vision, and so he's
talking to them in the context that they'll understand at the time which they're at that moment.
Yeah, that's right. And so he goes to this high mount. So he's moved from a valley. Remember the valley of slaughter, which is where the battle of Gog and Magog. Yep. And the valley of dry bones. So he's moved from there. Now he's moved to this mountain, and that geographical shift is important in these visions. And he goes to the high mountain. He sees a group of buildings that look like a city. Now this is actually the temple precinct, and the reason it looks like a city is because it's all walled in. It's got these massive walls around it, and this is the walls that he sees. They're actually like about 10 meters.
10 feet deep.
Yeah, 10 feet by 10 feet, so about 3 meters by 3 meters, and that is, again, to mark it off. It's very much separating the holy from the common.
Yep.
And that's an important idea through this. So it's like a compound. It's a walled compound. And then you get these gates, and they're massive fortress-style defensive gates.
Yeah.
And you get this, then within these gates, this buffer zone between the temple. So you've
sort of the guards.
It's all this language of separation, right? And you get this in Revelation 22, that on the inside and the outside, and on the outside are are those who are defiled in some sense, and then in the inside. So even this sort of language of them, there being outsiders and insiders, in Revelation 22 is still there.
Yeah.
It's those who have been made holy and those who have not been made holy, that gets retained in Revelation 22. And so you've got these buffer zones here. And again, there's a theological picture of the holiness of God and the importance of that and the distinctness that's being marked there.
Yeah.
The inner court is this perfect square. It's interesting, that's actually elevated another 3 meters high. It's guarded by another 3 gates. So you've got the temple architecture, but you've also got elevation within the temple architecture. In the original temple, it was just a flat space with the parts, but in the inner court of the temple, it's again, elevated by another 3 meters, which is significant, so you can't even see really over the top of that. And then it's got another 3 big gates. And so you've really got this, grades of holiness here in a sense, and that actually is a perfect square as well. The inner court is a perfect square.
Yep.
And in the center of the inner court is the altar. So it's interesting that in the original temple, the altar wasn't centralized, but here it is. It's in the center of the square.
Right. Yep.
That's just interesting, the way that the furniture works and the way that it puts the altar into the center. That's what we have in chapters 40 to 42. And again, I'd encourage listeners to, jump online and Google a picture of Ezekiel's temple.
There's some great 3D kind of walkthroughs if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
There are. Yeah, there's lots of stuff available. And then, of course, importantly, chapter 43, we have this vision of the glory of God returning to his temple. And, he says, then the man brought me to the gate facing east, and I saw the glory of God, the God of Israel, coming from the east. Now, remember, earlier in Ezekiel chapter 8, we have this vision of God moving out towards the east. Now God is coming back to the east. Now, the sense here is that whereas in the earlier vision, the movement away was this gradual staged move. It was, he was here and then he was there and then he was here. Here there's almost this sense of not a slow staged movement back, but a sudden move back. Right. Yeah, yep. Like I'm back. That's right. So verse 4, the glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Now, the other interesting thing that happens here is that the eastern gate is then closed.
Yeah.
And locked and
never to be opened.
Never to be opened.
Yeah.
So the sense is here that the glory of God is returning and will never again depart.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So chapter 44 is where this talks about the closing of the eastern gate, and you can visit this site today. The actual site of the eastern gate was built, reconstructed by the Crusaders, and they walled up the gate because they believed that Jesus entered the Temple Mount by this gate on Palm Sunday, and that it should be closed until he returns to re-enter the Temple Mount. So the structure that's there today and the blocking up of that gate, represents that belief on the part of the Crusaders. Certainly Zechariah chapter 14 presents the Messiah coming to the valley on the eastern side of the temple in preparation for his entry into the temple area. And, this sort of is the evidence that this gate should remain closed until Jesus returns. So it's actually called the Golden Gate.
The Golden Gate,
yeah,
that's right.
Today. And it's a significant site not only for Jews and Christians, but also for Muslims as well. Yeah. Muslims believe that the gate is going to be the site of the final judgment, and they call it the gate of heaven and hell. They believe that the final judgment of humanity is going to take place before the Eastern Gate, and the redeemed are those who will be allowed to enter the Temple Mount, and all others are going to be outcast. So actually, they've got the Muslim cemetery is actually alongside that eastern wall in anticipation
of that happening.
For that. Wow. So, if you're really privileged, you got to be buried like right there in the on the eastern side of the wall.
So
maybe
first in line.
You're first in line somehow.
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway, because the interesting thing is on the other side of the hill, you've got going up to the Mount of Olives, you've got all the Jewish cemeteries. And I think there's a bit of a dig at that too, because on the day of resurrection, it's like, we're sort of first in line, something like that.
Except it says the first shall be last and the last shall
even still fighting from the grave, oh man, you just feel the, the tension there between, the tension of worldviews. It's such a fascinating and in such a complex place. Anyway.
So that was chapter 44.
So that's chapter 44. Shuts the gate behind him. And then there's this figure of the prince who's interesting. There's been some discussion over who this prince is. And, and some have seen this as well. The prince is the Messiah. But there are some problems with that, because the prince offers sacrifices for his own sins. He's given very limited powers. It looks, in the text, it looks like his powers are being limited, not expanded, in some sense.
Yes.
And I think it's better actually to see this as a sort of a limitation of kind of worldly power in favor of divine power exercised through this priestly group, because the priest has that one level of separation. The priests are in the center, and then the prince, he sort of is next in line. One of the problems, of course, leading up to this period and leading to the fall of Israel, and this has been addressed in Ezekiel, was the way that the shepherds really corrupted the sheep, in a sense.
Yes.
And God, through Ezekiel, is holding these false shepherds
to account.
Yeah. And so it's natural then that this would address that the prince, it's interesting, he's not referred to as the king, he's referred to as the prince, and he is this figure of relative importance, but not absolute importance here. And so I see a lot of commentators prefer to see this as a sort of answer to the problem of kings just being a little bit too exalted, perhaps, and so this limits the powers of the prince, and there's a concern here for justice and so forth. So this is, I think, bringing, I guess, an ideal around leadership and what leadership looks like, godly leadership, like servant leadership. I think Jesus picks up on these themes about true godly leadership. It's not about lording it over people like the Gentiles do, but this more servant leadership thing. And I think in some ways that same theme is being possibly addressed here with these instructions around the prince. In chapter 45, by the way, it's interesting, we get further, in chapter 44, you get this further refinement of who actually can minister in the temple. It's not just any Levite, but only Zadokite priests.
Yeah.
So the whole holiness code that Ezekiel as a priest is very familiar with, this is now refined significantly, because remember, we're at a time where who gets to be counted as God's people is refined now. We're now down to a remnant, the remnant of Judah. In this vision, the serving priestly family then is also being refined to the Zadokite priests, based on the faithfulness of Zadok, the priest.
And then, of course, in the New Testament, we see Jesus takes the place, of the priesthood in a sense. So we no longer have the Levitical or Aaronic priests. We now have the new priests, which we see in Hebrews,
that's
obviously.
Right.
1 Peter. Yep.
In chapter 45, this is where we get the distribution of the land, and I've talked a little bit about that already with that sacred strip of land. And as I said, you can even have a look at a layout of the land. There's actually a few different
versions of that.
There's a few different interpretations of that. You've also got land for the prince there. This is the land for the prince is also important. This is addressing some problems around territory as well. The prince has set land, and it's not to exceed that. Think of the story of Naboth's vineyard, with Ahab, and he took his land, and so this is kind of setting limits on that he can't just take over whatever he wants. Which for kings in the ancient world, pretty much you own the whole lot. Yeah. Well, here,
you
don't.
Take it, it's yours.
Yeah, that's right. Here, it's limiting that. Some really interesting ideas here around leadership as well. If you really look into this, it's interesting here too that while the people, because it addresses chapter 45, also addresses the offerings that the people are to bring, and it's interesting to note that the prince is actually to provide a lot of the offerings. The people provide the materials for the regular offerings, but it's the prince's responsibility from his own resources actually to provide the offerings for the special occasions. The Sabbaths, the new moons, the annual festivals. He has actually a central role as the representative of the people in worship. That's the point.
Right.
So he is the sort of the first worshipper in that sense, the prince.
Right.
So, again, there's a correction where it had in the past had been politicized. You got kings that are mainly known for their, political machinations and their warring and so forth. But here is primarily as a worshipper. So you get this kind of Davidic figure here. That's the sense that you get, is someone that looks a bit more like David. But again, not to the extent, because he's also bringing offerings for his own sins and so forth. I do think it's potentially a bit of a stretch to see this as a messianic figure. However, it's not impossible, because you could take that symbolically as well. So we're not presenting very clear answers here, Stu. But
it's difficult to get clear answers the more you think about it. But again, the question probably is, in terms of what Jesus did, what's the point of the sacrifices? Which I guess is the question we're asking here, as we look at this as a future thing. And I think what you're alluding to there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is more an act of worship than necessarily atonement, even though it does say for the atonement of sin. So it is difficult to kind of get a clear understanding of the meaning of this. But again, let's remember this was being shared with a group of people who obviously we're very familiar with this form of temple worship. And I think really the big key here was, through the vision that Ezekiel's sharing, is that God was going to return to his people, and he was never going to leave them again.
No, that's right. Chapters 45 and 46 actually again deal with this issue of the land. I mean, the issue of the possession of the land, I mean, this is a pressing concern for these essentially landless exiles.
Because land held a very specific, spiritual context.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not just my block of land and I'll grab another one over there. No, there was a whole ancestral spiritual ownership of this land.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that was an eternal promise. It was an everlasting promise as well. And so this is where, the connection with the Jubilee, I mentioned the 25 year, it's 25 years to the Jubilee. Well, Jubilee meant that the land was restored to its original traditional owners, right? Yeah. So I think there's a sense of that God is going to fulfill his promise, but in an even greater way. And so he's fulfilling his promise, but it's not going to go back to the land divisions in Joshua. It's not even going to go back to Judah and Benjamin receiving their land. It's not just about the land of Judah, but it's actually all 12 tribes, which is interesting here. Yeah, exactly. And they're all going to receive their portion of the land. This is where you get that, and so you think, man, the 12 tribes, all 12 tribes are restored here. Now, we've already seen in chapter 36, the second half of chapter 36.
The drawing of the nations.
That's right. This idea of
the gathering of the nations.
The breaking, the stick that he joins together to become one stick. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, he's going to restore them both together under one king, the Messiah. And so here, again, you get a expression of that same promise, but in a different sort of sense. In chapter 47, we have this stunning picture of the river.
Yes.
The river flowing out from the temple. Now, this image of a life-giving river flowing from the sanctuary, we actually get this in a number of places in Scripture.
Yeah.
It's quite a ubiquitous vision here from the opening chapters of Genesis, where we have the river flowing from Eden and watering, like watering the garden. And pretty much, and then famously in Revelation chapter 22, you got the river of life flowing from the throne.
And water was such a sign of purification in these days.
Yeah.
It's like, water was the form of purification.
And of life as well, really.
Totally.
And, Psalm 46, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. And so, I mean, some interesting features of this, Stu, to note, and this is one that you could easily miss. He says that the water was flowing from the south side of the temple, south of the altar. Now, this is where the brass sea. There was a big container of water, like probably the size of a kind of jacuzzi, kind of small pool, but it was referred to as the sea, the brass sea, and that's actually in the original temple furniture is quite a rich piece of symbolism there, because of course the sea for ancient people had this association with the powers of death and chaos. And so by referring to that as the sea, it's like contained within, the sea is contained within the temple precinct.
Yeah, right.
It's controlled and contained.
Yeah.
And so there's almost this symbolism there that the powers of death and chaos are contained within the holy place of God. You know, they have their place and it's contained. Now, the interesting thing is here, instead of with the temple furniture, is that we don't get the brass sea. Instead of the brass sea, we get this flow of this river. Right?
Yeah.
So you still get water, and that water was also used by the priests for cleansing as well.
Yes.
Symbolizing the cleansing of sin as well. It's interesting, the association with death and then the cleansing from sin and so forth there. But here you get the river of life instead of this brass sea resembling death. But there's still the idea, of cleansing here, and as we'll see, of healing as well. It starts with a trickle, interestingly. And it ends in a torrent. That's not really, normally how things work.
Yeah.
So it as it goes outwards, it actually increases.
It gathers.
Not because it's got lots of other trickles joining it, like rivers are fed by many different springs. This is just the one trickle that, as it goes further and further, and of course he's told, he steps into the river and it's up to his ankles, then it's up to his knees, and
to the point,
and then it becomes this. Yeah. This vast river that no one can cross, it's
giving life to all sorts of things.
Yeah. So it flows, and the interesting thing is, the further it goes out, the more it broadens. And here there is this vision,
and the deeper it gets,
deeper it gets, right? And so there's this sense that, and this is the importance of this vision. While the holy precinct is walled in and contained, the holiness of God, it's not to shut out. It's not like God saying, I'm shutting myself in, as it were, and to shut everyone out. In a sense, what God is saying with this is that, and this by extension, we can apply to our lives in the sense that being holy, we are to be holy not so that we can become an enclave, but so that we can reach out with greater power.
Yeah.
So that we can be a light to the nations.
Yes.
So the walling in of this temple precinct and the separation, the creation of this holy precinct is not an end in itself. Because of the creation of that holy precinct, there is the creation of this river that then flows out and brings healing to all of the world, right? Yeah. So there's this, fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise.
Yep.
I will bless you, right? And I'm setting you apart, and you are going to be blessed, but not just as an end in itself. Yeah. I mean, in a way, it is, of course, because, people are ends in themselves. But anyway, he then says, and through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so here we see the river going east and significantly going down into the Dead Sea. So he's using the geography of the land to illustrate something.
To them. Yep.
So it flows into the Dead Sea, which is very, very dead.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing can live in that Dead Sea.
And when it hits the sea, it turns to fresh water.
That's right. Yeah. And all along the side of the river, I mean, trees are growing and they're bearing their fruit, perpetually bearing their fruit. Yeah. I mean, this is. At this point, this is where you really do see that this is theological. It's like, in some sense, everything so far you think, well, that could be literally fulfilled, but here you've very much got a theological vision, of a river that starts with a trickle and becomes a great torrent. It's going out to the nations. This is essentially what you see in Acts chapter 2 when they start speaking in these miraculously in these different languages. It has this symbolism in that miracle that the gospel is now going to go out. That the flow of God's Spirit that had been poured out is now going to cross all national boundaries, going to go out and out and out and bring life, right? Yeah. And so you get that imagery here with the, flows into the Dead Sea and everything comes to life. It's a stunning vision.
And yet verse 11's a bit of an odd one there. It's like, in the midst of all of that, yet its swamps and marshes will not be healed. They will be left for salt.
Well, that's important because salt was very, very valuable. So
Right.
I think
Okay,
in the vision they're not being robbed of anything.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. It'll be left for salt. Yeah,
not left as salt in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
salt. Right.
Yeah. So there's still the source of what was one of the most valuable materials in those times, which was salt. So
right. Yeah.
He revisits the boundaries of the land,
the tribal allotments.
Yeah, it's interesting here. Just some features to notice about this actually. First of all, it's a larger area of territory than was ever controlled by Israel. So, first of all, it's depicting something larger than they ever had, but it's actually the same land that was promised to Moses. That what's described here, exactly matches what was promised to what God promised to Moses that He would give His people.
Right.
So this is about fulfillment.
Yes.
And the interesting thing is, it doesn't include the Transjordanian areas, like east of the Jordan. Remember, according to the story, some of the tribes, the half tribe of Manasseh and Reuben and Gad, they said, we're going to take over there. Yeah, just we'll
stay here.
We'll stay here and have these lands, but that actually wasn't originally part of the plan. But there was a concession. Yes, you can have those lands. Now here, it doesn't include that.
Not included,
because this is really about showing that the promise to Moses is fulfilled. Yeah. It's also really interesting here is the fact that foreigners are given a full hereditary portion and made full citizens here. I think that's enormously significant. Verse 22, you are to allot an inheritance for yourselves and for foreigners residing among you and who have children. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. Yeah. Now remember, this is on the back of the river of life flowing outwards, right? So this, I think, is important because it's a symbol of the inclusion of the nations, being grafted into Israel. Yeah. So they're no longer to be sort of second class, like proselytes. No, they're full. They're to have a full inheritance alongside Israel. So that's a really interesting feature of this. As I said, it's different to Joshua's division. It's more even, and it's also oriented along the sacred east-west axis. You know, that's important. So it's, again, there's a symbolism in that the temple furniture was oriented along that sacred east-west sort of axis. And that's, as I said, you could possibly read this if you look at the divisions of the land, you set it all out. As I said, you could possibly see this as landing on Shiloh but that's a little conjectural. And it's interesting too that the prince's land here has intermediate importance after the priests and Levites. Mentioned that as well. There's some interesting features of this. The most interesting one here, the one that I highlighted here, was that portion for the foreigners. That was like, wow, I hadn't noticed that as starkly before. Yeah, that's pretty much where we finish. Right at the end, we have this bit about the gates of the city. And of course, the name of the city at the very end. That's right. The city is a perfect square. The temple precinct is a perfect square, and the name of the city is "The Lord is there." That's where it finishes. And relating that to Revelation 21 and 22, the promise was, "I will be with them, and they will be my people, and I will be their God." The emphasis on "and I will be with them," and so the key thing about all of this, chapter 40 right through to chapter 48, the key thing about this is that God will be there. That's the promise for the people. I will be with you. I will dwell among you. That's the promise that's stated here. It's repeated right through the book of Ezekiel. This is a major theme. I will be with my people. It's such a beautiful way to end this book because it states the goal of everything. This is God's heart's desire, is to be with his people and to be their God. And as I said, it's repeated through Ezekiel, and it's what God wants for any of us. He's drawing us in to his presence, into his holy place. He's giving us access. He's grafting us in, as we've said. We are the foreigners that have been, as Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. After Daniel, we're going to actually go back to the New Testament. We're going to talk about Ephesians. He talks about, once you were aliens and strangers, but now you've been brought in and you've been made part of God's house, right? So he picks up on that same imagery of this, the house of God, and being included in that. But the goal of all this is that we would be with God.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.